It's like dog bones from heaven.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us each different gifts. If we ask ourselves, well, what aspect really ignites my passion around the Quran?
Welcome to another episode of Coffee with Karim. I am your host, Karim Sirajuddin, founder of Nude Human Consulting. I'm very happy today to have Dr. Celene Ibrahim on the show today. Welcome, Dr. Celene.
It's an honor to be with you, Karim. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Where are you calling in from today, sister?
I'm in the great town of Groton, Massachusetts, just north of Boston.
Wow, nice. Mass is my birthplace and where I was mostly shaped and nourished. That's why I'm so salty.
I'm surprised you got out. A lot of people get in the vortex here and don't need to leave. So many good people, good institutions. But
Totally. Yeah, I mean, what I love about Boston is definitely the the directness, that it's hard to make friends, but once you do, they're like lifelong, right? Once you break in. But the reason why I got out, based on what you're saying, is because I didn't grow up loving sports like everybody loves sports, just random guys at the gas station like, hey, what's the score? I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about or whether or not you're talking about hockey or baseball or football. And then, of course, the weather. It's just, doesn't work with my genes, so... So, Dr. Celene, I'm very happy to have you on, and a fellow Massachusettsite, I guess. What would be the term for that? There's other terms, but I won't use them. So that's an inside joke for people from Mass. But Dr. Celene, tell us a little bit more about what you do and why you do what you do.
Yes. Well, I'm a student of the Quran first and foremost, and that manifests in different forms. So for me, sometimes that means writing a book or an article or a blog, and other times that means educating about the Quran, and other times that means just sitting with the Quran myself and coming to the Quran with a question. And more broadly, I teach Islamic studies and I teach religious studies, and I've taught in many different contexts in the university and graduate schools and theological schools. And currently I'm teaching in a high school, and I'm teaching, alhamdulillah, it's a real honor and also a challenge to work with young people at a time when they really do have deep questions about life and about their own spirituality and their own religious upbringing or their own capacity to differentiate from their parents, for instance.
So, Sister Celene, your name is Celene, your last name is Ibrahim, you're a student of the Quran. So are you studying the Quran also in Arabic? And if you are, why don't you give us some, motivation? Because I know a lot of people, even born Muslim, they're like, there's always that Arabic thing. Like, I got to get to my Arabic. I got to study Arabic. When am I going to know Arabic? So maybe you can remind us that, of your pursuit and what were some of the ways you overcame that challenge, especially if you weren't a native speaker.
Yes, well, I became Muslim in my early 20s, alhamdulillah, and that's the point at which I started learning Arabic. And I actually started learning Arabic before I started becoming a Muslim, at least conscientiously. And I think one of the things that supported me along the way was the principle that if you struggle with a letter, you'll be rewarded even more than a native speaker. And people all across the world would tell me that wherever I would go, and I would feel frustrated, and I'd be really craving a breakthrough and would just be pushing on without any sense of a breakthrough. And that principle would keep me going. And the very first time I actually picked up a mushaf, I didn't even know it was called a mushaf at that point, but I had been reading a translation of actually Al-Ghazali in English, and I said, I want to see what this verse is like in context. And so a friend had given me an Arabic English Quran, and I had just known enough Arabic to start trying to piece letters together into words. And so I reached for that volume, and I just opened it randomly, and right at the top of the page was the ayah that I had been reading from the Al-Ghazali book. And, it just gave me shivers, and things like that have not, alhamdulillah, that's been part of my relationship with the Quran, that anytime I feel that I'm giving it time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I feel like reciprocates with little gifts in the Quran itself. And so that sustenance, if you will, that seeming confirmation of my struggle, that it is bearing fruit, that's what's kept me going.
It's like dog bones from heaven, I call them, because it's like I'm so hungry, God, I want a steak, and I'm fighting for a steak, but once in a while you're just not, your metabolism isn't ready for the steak and potatoes. So, but you do get a few appetizers or little dog biscuits to chew on and be like, oh, nice, I got some validation, right? So I think that's a really good reminder, is that people often think things aren't working when they don't get the outcome or the end results right away, right? Mm-hmm. We have to recognize that every little step in your effort is part of the success, right? Your success is based on hundreds of steps or hundreds of days or hours or thousands, and eventually it consolidates. So this is what you're reminding us of here.
And, another principle really helps me. It's that even when I look to people who have memorized the Quran back to front, they're still students of the Quran and they're still learning. And that's one of I think the most beautiful principles within Islam, that it is that ocean of wisdom.
Totally. So today, Dr. Celene, you're going to take us on the lovely journey of learning more about how to improve our relationship to the Quran and how the Quran can help us improve in our relationships amongst each other.
Mm-hmm. So the first thing that I think of in terms of forming a relationship with the Quran is actually forming a relationship with other people who also value the Quran. Because I find that the more I'm surrounded by people who are also making, engagement with the Quran an emphasis in their life, the more I'm going to do it. And for me in particular, this takes the form of having a regular person with whom I study. And she would say she's studying with me, but I think I'm studying with her. And that relationship is such a precious one, and it's based on our mutual love of the Quran. And so I think, practically speaking, it's good to look for people like that in our lives. And if we do already have people like that in our lives, to make a priority to spend the time with them and with the Quran. So that's one aspect I think that is important.
For sure. Now, at the beginning of your Islam, did you kind of see the Quran as the main pursuit of knowledge, like in your early years? Because I know that some people today, Islam, the Quran is almost like number 7 on the list of like, how do I improve? It's like, oh, I'm going to listen to this person, or I'm going to go join this social activist group. And a lot of things are kind of, cloaked in Islam or related to Islam. But, it's like many people don't go to the Quran itself, right, or the authentic Sunnah for the answers, right? They're still asking somebody or some other group or some other movement, right? But why is this sometimes dangerous or even harmful to one's faith if you're always listening to how other people interpret what the Quran says, even though that's not always a problem, but and you don't have your own personalized relationship with the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I think this is really important, everyone, because we know that if I had you're married? Okay. So let's take the analogy of husband and wife, right? So if you never answer your husband when he talks to you at home, or he calls you and sends you text messages, especially when you're out all day or you're even traveling for a conference, right? What's probably going to happen, right? There's going to be a distance, a feeling of, resentment even over time. I'm not cared for. There's no meaning that we're exchanging or resolving here. So I say, what about the divine text messages and, phone calls, if you will, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is what we call revelation? I mean, if we really believe this is the speech of Rabbil Alameen, I mean, that every time I tell myself that, and this shows a big reminder for me, first and foremost, I'm like, wow, how am I living up to that belief? Because if it's really what we say it is, this should be the speech we want to hear the most, even more than the speech I give myself, which is difficult. But, so that's what comes up for me in this idea of the importance of having a relationship to the Quran. And I'd love to hear, what you have to add to that feedback.
Yes, I mean, to me, it's something that I want to know. I want to know it like I know my own hand, to kind of appropriate a Quranic metaphor. And it's that degree of certainty. So much in life is, in fact, quite uncertain. And here is words that, in them there is no doubt. And that, to me, is a refuge from all the other uncertainties in life. And I think that's the gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given this ummah. And, I that was one of the facets of Islam that attracted me in the very beginning.
Yeah. The improving of relationship to the Quran, one tip you gave us so far is have good companions that remember Allah and His Messenger and, things of benefit often, but specifically those who have a serious practice or, let's say ritual around engaging with the Quran beyond, once a year in Ramadan or once a week at Jummah. Even though if that's what you're doing, great, Allah increase you, but, we want to, again, if this is really the speech of God, right? It's like you wouldn't ignore a message from your boss for a week straight if it was sitting in your voicemail, or your wife or your husband or even your mother or father, etc. So what about the messages from Allah? Can you tell us a little bit more about how do we also improve this, realization, essentially, right?
Yes, and I think before we go too far on that point, I think just to emphasize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us each different gifts. And so, for instance, I'm really interested in grammar. So when I engage the Quran, something comes out in that aspect. And another person might be interested in the philosophy and the deep meaning. And, another person might have perfect tajweed. And so part, I think, of the importance of engaging the Quran with other people and hopefully, ideally, with a deep friendship, a companionship that evolves, with that person around the Quran. It's also that recognition of you don't have to be perfect in understanding the meanings and being able to pronounce it and, being able to read it fluently. And that's part of the way that we validate each other's spiritual gifts is, in finding ways to share them with each other. And so I think sometimes if we ask ourselves, well, what aspect really ignites my passion around the Quran? That might be a way in for people who might be either hesitant, feeling like they just don't know enough, or feeling like that it's too overwhelming a task to just begin.
Yeah. So if I feel stuck and it's so overwhelming, I don't even know what the Fatiha means. Where do I start? Like, do I just read the English? Do I, as an academic, as a professor yourself, how would you guide me as your student? Like, I want to know Arabic. I'm frustrated. I only know English. I'm 45. I'm 25. Is it too late for me? What would you have to say to people who think like that?
Mm-hmm. So I think people, if they focus on, even if it's an ayah that speaks to them deeply, and then learn how to say it with tajweed, learn the deep meanings of each of the words, understand how the letters connect with one another, contemplate it. And I think going at that pace, just small chunk by small chunk by small chunk, and giving the Quran, giving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that open channel of communication, that to me is maybe a good place to start. And for different people, what ayah or what surah that is going to be different. But I'd say just, even if it's just to say Bismillah and open the Quran and point and there's your ayah, and dissect it and understand it and seek out someone who can help you learn it. And, step by step like that, maybe you'll get to all 6,000 plus of them, inshallah.
Inshallah. I think that's great advice. In fact, that's advice I've given myself and try to remind myself of, which is, look, isn't it better to know one verse of the Quran word for word, like really know, like asbab and nuzul, the reasons why it was sent down, the context, the vocabulary. I have an Quranic dictionary that I've got tons of footnotes, and I'm a vocab word geek, so I'm not as excited about the grammar maybe as you are, but I love words and be like, oh, what is that? I want to look that up, and then I go look up the root, and I tell people, look, just learn. Like in Ramadan, we often go for like, I gotta do khatm, I gotta do this, I gotta do that. MashaAllah. But if you still don't know what the Fatiha means, just make Ramadan about you learning the word for word meaning of Fatiha. And what I mean by that is you go Bismillah, and you can translate B, ism, right? Illah, right? And you know what those mean, and why does it say Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in when you are a servant and have a master, it already includes reliance and dependency, but yet isti'ana re-emphasize that. Like, I just remember when I learned the meaning of Qul Huwallahu Ahad, Al-Fatiha, and all of these short surahs that we all mostly learn at first, Ayat al-Kursi, it just takes you to this whole other level. Even when you recite the surahs in prayer, right? I mean, a lot of us recite Qul Huwallahu Ahad every day in our salah, right? And Fatiha, certainly, you have to. So just taking word for word, you're telling us, and learning that, it's like, I always tell people, knowing one verse of the Quran with its full meaning is like having a string of pearls. Having the whole Quran memorized and not knowing what it means, it's like carrying around a huge, heavy, locked treasure chest. So what? Great. It's people, you have treasure, but you can't open it, and you can't really get all the value or even enjoy the beauty of the ornamentation of that, of all that Quran, right? So that's also important because, obviously there's still barakah in memorizing Quran, even if you don't know what you're saying, because I believe the very vibration itself impacts the heart in such a way. But some people still, it's like not even that's going to come across, consciously for the individual. So it's like as if they're studying, Greek or Mandarin. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts about that?
As I was hearing you speak, it reminded me that some of my deepest insights and connections have come when I was then teaching what I had learned. So if I took the time to try to understand a particular ayah as best as I possibly could, oftentimes if I could turn around and then try to explain what I learned to someone else, I feel as though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give me an immediate reward in another insight that I had not come across just in my own effort. So there's tremendous barakah, not only in learning it, but then in turning around and teaching it as well.
Right. What other key concepts do you feel, Sister Celene, we need to know about our relationship or improving that to the Quran?
Yeah, so I think that the sense that we're living in an age of distraction, and the more we can put reminders on our telephones or put Post-it notes around our house, or just ways to keep trying to refocus. And it's this is advice that I give myself too, and that oftentimes, even if work is piling up, or I have an overdue phone call to my mother-in-law, if I can just squeeze in just a little time with the Quran, then it makes other things go so much more smoothly in life. And so that's perhaps the challenge that we're in this time. But we also have an incredible advantage, and you hinted at it before, is that when we want to know the meaning of a word, we can just put it into, the online dictionary. When we want to, look up a book, we don't have to travel to the next town generally to discover the parchment, to decipher it, and so that sense of everything we need is right at our fingertips. And it's just that the focused attention. And so whatever ways in which I think we can habituate and put in routines to be able to help us focus is a really important factor.
Yeah, I mean, it is a double-edged sword, right? The resources we have today, because many people, it is the reason why they have that accessibility, that they're so distracted and wasting so much time, whether it's social media, YouTube, all this stuff, right? But on the other hand, with the same click of a button, I could be accessing all kinds of great powerful knowledge that can shape me and mold me into a better person, right? And so there is, of course, that intention, but of course, intention sometimes can only stay as alive as we create action to follow it, right? إِنَّ الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Our intentions are shaped. Excuse me, our actions are shaped by our intentions, but our intentions also don't keep coming up as solid or in the right direction if we also aren't conditioning and training ourselves with action and behaviors, as prerequisites or parallel to that, right? So it's not easy. Like, for example, you always hear that question of how do I be patient? And the person's in the middle of a calamity right now. It's like, well, you have to practice patience all the time so that when something, smashing hits, you actually have more resilience. But you can't, it's hard to get what you need after you already needed it, right? So this is also an important point, I think, that you're reminding us of here.
So one thing I was thinking of as you were speaking was the practice of going to the Quran with a particular question and, starting with a dua and really asking Allah for guidance on that particular question. And sometimes I've had questions that have been with me 2 years, 3 years, but I keep asking them. And a lot of times there's a moment when something just clicks and I can put one ayah next to another ayah and have a sense of understanding on a particular idea that then goes on to influence some way of being in the world or being in relation to people in my life. And so that kind of reading with a specific purpose in mind, really asking Allah, taking us back to where we maybe started this conversation, to reveal to our hearts, in a sense, through this revelation.
Right. So can you give us an example? Like, I have the question of, will I get married this year? Like, do I approach the Quran now with that? Or like, again, what people every day aren't necessarily looking for the secrets of the universe, although that would be cool, but not everyone's like, oh, I want to find some secret of the universe by opening up the Quran. It's usually things like, will my mom be okay from her cancer? Will I get married? Will I get this job? Etc.
Yeah, so those are some great examples. So for instance, if you are thinking about getting married, well, the Quran talks about marriage a lot. So maybe a good way to demonstrate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you're ready for a spouse is to understand what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said about marriage. And that's what I mean about going to the Quran with a question like this. And for me, that's been a lot about what is my value, worth, role as a woman in society. And I've taken that question, that going to the Quran with that question actually ended up being the subject of my dissertation research and my first monograph. And so obviously it's partially answered. Perhaps some aspects of it have become answered, but oftentimes that deep question is, for me, the lens through which a lot of the Quran comes to life. And whether that's in thinking about the female figures in the Quran, which has been the subject of a lot of my research, or it's thinking about issues like how to be a sister or a mother or a daughter, that those issues to me are both profound but also everyday. And that tension for me has always been very interesting. How do you apply the Quran in concrete ways, but also try to understand bigger questions? So why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create a species that is male and female? And why does the Quran discuss it continually that way? And for instance, what does that tell us about the way in which we see gender expressed in our world today? And so those big ideas, I enjoy taking questions like that to my reading and engagement with the Quran. But then they also tell me things about just my everyday life and decisions that I make on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Celene, can you take us in that direction? I'd love to hear more about that. Men and woman, gender, like what have you taken away as far as those themes, and how does it concretely work in our everyday lives?
I want to know you, Allah. I want to love you, Allah. I want to love you. I want to need you more than I try. La ilaha illa Allah, la ilaha, la ilaha illa
Men and woman,
Allah.
gender, like what have you taken away as far as those themes, and how does it concretely work in our everyday lives?
Yes. So when I took my initial question to the Quran, it was something like this. Like, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you name prophets that seem to be all men, and you tell sacred history through a lens that is largely focused on patriarchs. So what is the role of women and matriarchs in society? And so that was my starting point many, many years ago, actually. And through asking that question, I've been perhaps able, in my own head at least, to unpack many of the Quranic verses, for instance, that value women's insights and contributions to society. So, for instance, Maryam delivers the word of God. She does it physically with her body going into labor. And so that to me is a profound affirmation of, let's call it a spiritual competency that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given uniquely to women generally. Through kind of thinking about how that lets me think about prophecy and prophethood, I think then I go and have a more nuanced understanding, perhaps, of who the prophets were and how their message was conveyed. So, for instance, if you take a figure like Musa, alayhi salam, Moses, he had not only a mother who was receiving, revelation, wahi, to her, but then he also had a foster mother who was an emblem of courage. He had a sister who was witty and quick to act and very caring about his well-being. He had a wife who essentially got her father to propose on her behalf to Moses. You might have the prophetic figure of Musa, alayhi salam, but the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us his story is largely him being carried from one station to the next in his life by these women figures. And so that it doesn't, someone could read that and say, why is there a male protagonist and then all of these women are just playing supportive roles? And does that mean that women in society can never be like the protagonist, or can never be the business owner, or can never be the politician? Or does that mean they're only relegated to these supporting roles? And I think that's such a simplistic reading of what's going on.
I love those two, and in fact, I was actually going to bring up Maryam, peace be upon her, but you took us there, subhanAllah, so Allah knows what's in our hearts. But I was just having that conversation with somebody a couple of weeks ago. I was like, I think Ibn Hazm was of the opinion that she was a prophet, and it's because I asked somebody who is, studying of the Quran, and I said, that's interesting because by definition, a prophet is somebody who, neba, you raise them in status. 2, they have vision of prophecy or something yet to come. Mary had both of those things. 3, she had miracles, right? But then there's the discussion about, okay, but did she bring scripture, or did she reinforce and preach a previous message, right? So, and then that's like the question, right? Is did she do that or did she not do that? And why wouldn't she be considered a prophet if she does meet the definitions of prophets? But then others say, well, because Allah says we always sent prophets as men. Again, I don't know, you can correct me.
Yeah, so the one thing that I noticed in looking pretty systematically at all the female figures who are mentioned is that no one preaches. There's not a single woman figure in the Quran that preaches in the way that oftentimes we see men preaching. And, you know, a simplistic reading would say, oh, then women shouldn't have a public speaking role or something like that. But I think there's something more sophisticated going on. Because you do, you know, for instance, you have the Queen of Sheba, and she has a powerful role. She is a skillful diplomat. She successfully, you know, evades war and et cetera, et cetera. I think what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put on the prophets that are explicitly mentioned as prophets in the Quran is this burden of preaching. And everything else that men do in the Quran, male figures, in terms of their relationship with God or their capacity as spiritual beings, you also then find women doing in other instances. And so it's a very specific aspect of preaching. It's not about woman's voice necessarily, but there is no place in the Quran where a woman has this responsibility of conveying the message to an entire people. They do other things.
Right. Which to me makes a lot of sense, because from what I know, every time a prophet came to his people, there was not a celebration and a big banquet to be like, they weren't happy with it, right? It was often met with aggression, violence, abuse. And so that's something a lot for a woman to take on, especially in historically speaking, right? Because the societies and structures of the way people were, it would have been, almost like an unrealistic task, to ask, even though Allah can do whatever He wants. But again, like you said, there's a lot of sophisticated lessons here that we have to look for. And as you said with Musa alayhi salam, if it wasn't for the feminine roles in his life, he wouldn't have been able to fulfill his messengership. So Allah is also showing us the yin and yang that's always taking shape, even though, as we know with the yin and yang symbol, the part of the masculine or the feminine protrudes more than the other side, but there's also aspects of the feminine that's stronger or protrudes over the masculine. So at times, the masculine and feminine energies, just like the names of Allah from Jalali and Jamali, for instance, it's more appropriate or more, effective if one power or force comes out in a certain way more than the other. But that doesn't mean that everything else now is overshadowed by that. No, it's all working together, and sometimes you've got to be out there, sometimes you got to be in here, because the same prophets who go home and are falling apart or are terrified of what's happening, or they're feeling inadequate, it's their wives and mothers and daughters that are like, no, get back out there and step up and do what Allah has commanded you to do. So what if the guy, what if the prophet was a single guy, and he came home and there's nobody there, right? So it's interesting that, as you're telling us here, is that sometimes I would argue, especially today, a lot of, newer generation Muslims who don't have a very, solid grounding in the history or the tradition itself, they kind of attack things in these very one-dimensional ways, right? It's like, oh, this means this or this means that. And it's like, just look things up and do some research.
Well, you said something that reminded me of another aspect in my research, is that almost every male figure that's explicitly mentioned as a prophet or a Rasul, Nabi or Rasul, is also at some point in the Quran also mentioned with their family. And to me, that is a profound emphasis on not just the male patriarch, but the role of that mostly supportive family, although we do see instances where the prophet is not supported by a wife figure.
Or another family member.
Yeah, exactly. I think as well, if we then take a lesson and try to apply it to our lives, I've gotten lots of questions about in my role as a chaplain and working with younger people who are contemplating marriage, why is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala places certain expectations on the male figure in the marriage and other expectations on a female figure in the marriage? And to me, partially we can look at the rules and regulations that are in the Quran to try to understand that, but we can also look at the stories and say, well, how does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala depict married figures in the Quran? And we see really fascinating things. So, for instance, going back to Musa, we see that his future wife sees in him, strength and trustworthiness. And so when I meet young Muslims who are asking me questions about, well, how do I get married? And my parents are pressuring me and I don't even know what to look for in a person. I say, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us this insight in the form of a story, really, that, look for trustworthiness and look for, that aspect of qawi, which, I joke with people that it could mean like, your bodybuilder type, but I think it's referring to inner strength so look for that in a person. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us. So even though you don't find a direct ayah that says, Muslimat, go look for the qawi, the mateen, or et cetera, you find the lesson in the story.
You're right. We have to have more, I want to say, intellectual and spiritual complexity and thirst, because if Islam, the way I like to frame it, Islam is a path to God. Islam is a toolkit to cultivate your relationship with the divine, right? And Islamic psychology is mine and your personal quest of that. Right? And like you said, not everything will appeal to everybody in the same way, or you might feel very drawn to grammar or this or that, or other people are really good at fasting every other day and I'm just like, oh, Ramadan is all I can do, I need my coffee. Yeah. Right? You want to turn on the light?
Yeah, exactly. Go for it. There we go. That's a bit better. What?
No, it's way better. It was pretty much all I saw was the nude of your soul, so I couldn't see your face anymore. MashaAllah, Allah increase you and your family. So there is this, of course, this idea of we also have to put in that effort and legwork to get innovative and creative. And if we're not, like you said earlier, putting ourselves in spaces where we can receive some of those gems and insights from Allah, i.e. through our effort, through our engagement, through our, I'm not going to give up even though I still can't read this ayah right, or I don't know what this word means yet, or what this verse is really trying to say yet. The point here is, if you're not seeking truth and having patience, wal asr innal insana lafi khusr, then you're not going to have an opportunity. You're going to always give up or close things, and sometimes you get it on the first go. Sometimes it takes 3 or 30. But what matters is, are you going to get it? And in the big picture, is it going to, comprehensively shift your heart and your mind as needs be? So that's definitely important. That like you said, it's like there isn't these clear here are the 10 things you look for in a future wife. Although I would argue you could say Surah Al-Mu'minun, for example, here are the qualities a real believer has. So you should probably look for those things in whoever you think, whoever you want to marry, because those are signs of what a real believer is. Bringing it back to Maryam is what's fascinating isn't it true, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Allah describes her as the best woman in alameen?
Well, the word is not the best per se. It's that she's chosen among all the women of the world, which to me is important, because oftentimes I think human beings were focused on, well, what is the best? And we can be the best in all different types of things. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose her, and she was chosen among, twice Allah says, astafa, so selected, chosen. And so she was chosen in some very specific respects. And then there's also other women in sacred history who are chosen in other respects. And I think that doesn't I think in our triviality, where we sometimes fall into the trap of going, well, who was the best woman ever? And I think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing us a lot more nuance. And on that point of Maryam alayhi salam being chosen, of course, the most obvious way that she was chosen is that she was chosen for this miraculous conception of Isa alayhi salam. But there's another aspect in which she's chosen, and I love that the Quran emphasizes twice that she was chosen. And this is an example of a question I've come to the Quran with for a really long time. Why is Maryam alayhi salam the only woman mentioned? And finally, in the end,
She's the only one mentioned by name, just to clarify?
yes, exactly.
Got it.
Only one
Okay.
mentioned by first name, not by title or like,
Right. SubhanAllah. And always associated with Isa when he's mentioned. Isa ibn Maryam.
yeah,
Or at least there are
many
accounts of
times,
it.
yeah. So
Yes, not every
it's
time.
actually, I don't want to get too distracted from the point I was just making, but this is also exciting. It seems that her name is mentioned 34 times in the Quran. That's roughly divided between times when the Quran is referring explicitly to her and times when the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is referring directly to Isa as the son of Maryam. So there's a certain balance there in the Quran. But the point I was making before is that she, in a sense, is chosen to be the only woman who's mentioned by name in the Quran.
SubhanAllah.
And
Yeah.
that's an example of something I struggled with for 5 years as I was writing a book essentially on the women figures in the Quran, trying to figure out why is it Allah that you only, give us one name of one woman and I don't know any of the others. And finally my heart just came settled on that is an aspect of Maryam alayhi salam, her chosenness.
Wow.
And Allah knows
So
best, but that quieted my heart, and that made me, gave me comfort about that particular question.
Yeah. Yeah. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is mentioned by name in the Quran.
Yes. So if you count a surah title that is oftentimes like Surah Muhammad, then you come up to 5 total, I believe.
5. But Musa ﷺ is mentioned most by name in the Quran. Right? So again, it's like, again, if we really just go with that, right? It's like Mary is chosen. She was chosen, like you said, in the Alameen, right? Then the Prophet ﷺ, we also know, is the chosen one. And he was the final messenger and prophet and the best of creation. Yet he's mentioned 5 times. And then Musa ﷺ is mentioned more than both of them, right? So it's just interesting because if we sit and try to like pick, because the prophet was the most recent, he has to be mentioned the most, or Musa was this, or so you have to be mentioned this amount of times, like the number of tribes of Israel. It's like, getting too caught up in all that is not healthy. But you were still asking that question, not from the numerical standpoint, but more of this meaningful standpoint. So why was it, attention for you? Like, were you just because you wanted to know, who are these other women that you were mentioning? Or is it like the case of, I forget the surah, Celene, please remind me. You know how like there's a surah in the Quran where people are arguing with Allah about, it might have been Bani Israel with the Baqarah or the story of the cave, and basically God's saying, look, it's irrelevant how many people were there or what color it needs to be or how many years it was. The point, you're missing the point, right? Can you just remind us of that lesson? Because I think it might tie to where we're going with this.
Yes. Well, there's a lot of ways we could take those particular examples. But for me, there's a tendency to maybe want to show how much we know, and it's a form of arrogance. And I think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with those kinds of examples, reminds us over and over and over again that the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us the relevant details that we need to know, and it's all there. And we don't need to get caught in the weeds of sources or semi-reliable sources trying to figure out the details. That we can first focus on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us explicitly and implicitly. And I guess that, to tie it back to what we were talking about before, that to me is one of the amazing things about the Quran, that it is an explanation of all things. And so to me, it's the rope of Allah, and it's something to cling to. And, we need other sources at a certain level to understand the Quran. But even if we just confine ourselves to focusing on this one book, we hardly have a need of any other source of sustenance in terms of our deep intellectual and spiritual needs. It's there, and we can benefit from other things, surely, and they can help to clarify. And it's important to understand the Quran through the writings of scholars. But at the same time, we have the sustenance right here. So to me, we just need to, continue to drink, and inshallah, Allah continues to open our hearts and minds and kind of pour into us through the ayat of the Quran some wisdom, inshallah.
Absolutely. And I would add that in order for us to stay hungry and thirsty for that sustenance, we have to accept and acknowledge that the Quran is not a crystallized text, right? It's not like, like Shakespeare, even today, people are still interpreting it and the nuances, and that's Shakespeare, right? So what about the words of Allah? Aren't the words of Allah alive? If it is the speech of Allah, and if the words of Allah are alive, and this is supposed to be a guidance for all people and all places, then that means the meaning and the life that it'll keep breathing into the souls that engage with it with sincerity. Your Islamic psychology is your personal quest for making meaning, right, of the Quran, of what it means to be a believer and an upright servant and human being and so forth. But I won't have that thirst and hunger if I don't realize this won't stop giving me sustenance and nutrient. It's not like, now I know what that means, I can put my feet up now and wait for Jannah, or I've mastered now every layer and level of this, right? Is that correct way to understand how to approach the Quran? Because, I get that sense that you're thirsty and hungry and you see that it's an ongoing sustenance, but many people see it as like, it's like, okay, I can just I studied it, or I'm academically studying the Quran, like but you're not actually studying it if you're not trying to live it, and certainly engage day-to-day life and see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and uses the universe as a means to communicate to you. Like we were saying earlier, we get those little bones from heaven or high fives from heaven, or God clearly shows us synchronicities like, I know exactly what you're thinking and what you're feeling right now, and this is no coincidence that you opened this and it was right in front of you, and it's Allah reminding you and I that don't you believe and keep your certainty and patience to pursue this truth, perhaps?
Mm-hmm. That's beautifully encapsulated. And I think even in this conversation now, I'm realizing that sometimes I or other people think of the Quran as a book on the shelf, and or maybe think of it as a recitation that comes through their earbuds. But it's alive in the hearts, and that to me is the kind of the metaphor of the garden. Like we're putting the letters are little seeds that we're putting in our hearts, inshallah, and that's where they grow and that's where they live, and inshallah that will be the protection, and that we need to go through this world, and inshallah to find a place place of prosperity in the next, inshallah. So I think just to round out what we've been saying, it's that energy and effort invested in the Quran has both immediate but also really long-term payback. And so even if it's working up the discipline to have a regular practice, or trying to reach out to a friend who will be a good influence on our own study habits and engage with the Quran with us in a way that illuminates it, or whether it's going to the Quran with a question and really seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's guidance on that thing through reading verses that pertain to a topic, or just reading with that open heart to accept the inner sense of guidance and wisdom that regularly comes, inshallah, when we engage with the Quran. And we talked about many other things, but those are some that come to mind. And I just ask Allah that we're always hungry for the sustenance that the Quran gives, and that it lives in our hearts, and that we take its advice and put it into practice, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you so much, Dr. Celene, for your time. We will certainly have you on again soon to discuss more topics around Quran, relationships, and women, inshallah. Jazakallah khair, and we'll see you soon, sister.
Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu
Assalamu alaikum.
alaikum.